You said that Detroit is built into the fabric of who you are. I love that. I feel like geography actually plays a big role in who people become. What about you is so Detroit?
Well, if people notice, I mean, I guess you can say this to a degree about everybody, is that everybody puts on for their city. But I feel like if you're from Detroit, you put on even harder
Mm.
because Detroit often does not get the attention that other major cities get. You know, we don't get the attention of New York or Chicago. Our sisters, it's
I
brothers and
thank you for
sisters. Yes,
the.
yes, the nod to Chicago. And so, you know, we don't get that love of a LA or a Miami. So when we go hard, we go hard, and because of that, we have this chip on our shoulders. You know, we feel the inferiority complex, but it also works to our benefit because it makes you want to grind and you want to show people that not only good things can come from Detroit, but that we have a different sense and work ethic than other places. You know, everybody in Detroit got to hustle. That's
Mhm.
just that's just how we grew up. That's how we're raised. And I think the fact that we have such a blue collar culture, being that the auto industry is, positioned and headquartered in Detroit, um, that gives, that kind of bleeds into your personality. It's like you grow up knowing that you have to prove yourself,
Yeah.
that you have to work hard, that you have a grit and a determination. And so all those things are very much fused into my DNA.
That grit is something I feel from all my Detroit friends.
Yeah.
And there's a groundedness too.
Hmm.
Like no matter where you guys go, you're the same person you've always been.
Yeah, I hear that from a lot of people. Like,
Yeah.
and that makes me feel good because everybody usually tells me like, "Oh, I know somebody from Detroit. Detroit people are the best." I think it's a combination of not just how we are raised in the city, but also the Midwest, as you know. Like, it's just different. You know, there's a different sense of value, a different sense of priorities in the Midwest, and we are generally friendly, I think. And so,
I think so
I think so,
too.
right? Like,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, I found in Chicago people to be wonderful. So
Thank
I have
you.
relatives in Chicago, and so I think just culturally, the Midwest is nicer. No disrespect to everywhere else, but it
I
is.
mean,
We're
Midwest is best. I will
Midwest is the
say it.
best. We're a little more friendly.
So you wrote my parents had a lot of drug issues when I was growing up. And the one thing I loved about writing is that if you don't like your reality, it allows you to create a new one. I love that you are a writer first. It's one of my favorite things. When I was researching for this interview, I could tell you truly love it. You don't just put that on your bio because it's like a thing that you do. Um, how did writing create this new reality for you?
So, writing is something I've loved from the beginning as a child. Two things I love to do: read and to write, which sounds very basic, but I was a voracious reader. And I also love to write fiction and poetry. I just really took to language in
Mm-hmm.
general. And when you read a book, it does transport you into another place. Really good books, you get lost in them. There's a reason why they say that. And even though I know people see the ESPN resume and some of the other things I've done, I didn't come to ESPN as a television personality. I came there as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what I did and have done the bulk of my career, despite the television success I've been fortunate enough to experience. So with writing, it was not only just about expressing myself, but it was also about telling stories and imagination. And when you grow up in some of the challenging circumstances that I did, with both my parents being recovering addicts, writing was very much a refuge for me. It was a safe haven for me. I could create without boundaries or limits. And it was also a sounding board.
Mm-hmm.
My earliest writings, beyond just the fiction and the poetry, was keeping a journal. And so in that journal, I was able to vent and to rage and to observe and to do all these things that I think are a very integral part of writing. Writing, especially, I would say journalism in particular, which is what I obviously gravitated toward. Journalism is about curiosity. It's about wanting to know how the world works and why. And I tell younger journalists this is like, you can't really be a journalist if you aren't curious.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't walk down the street and say, hey, I wonder why, if you don't do that, you're in the wrong profession. And so I had the sense of wonder, curiosity, and creativity. And because of that, journalism was just such a natural route for me to take.
I think it's interesting that you said creativity. What about creativity you think plays a role?
Well, I can't do math and I hate science. I mean, admire science and use science and believe in science, but oh God, it's so boring, right?
too.
You know what I'm saying? And math, it was like, oh, me and numbers do not get along. We are sworn enemies. And once you eliminate those two, like what's left? Oh, that's right, writing. I mean, I'm big on critical thinking, big on reading, big on discovery.
Yeah.
And I think creativity is a part of that. It was always easy for me to tap into my imagination and to use language to communicate sometimes the things that you can't do verbally.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it. And so I just said this recently to an author I was interviewing, is that reading her fiction novels, her name is Attica Locke, and she's written some amazing fiction novels. And I told her, I was like, reading you made me realize writing is you answering the questions you can't say out loud.
Mm-hmm.
That's what writing is. And so, that's what I've always tried to do, is like answer the questions I've always wondered and that people wonder. And sometimes those questions are uncomfortable, but you want to answer and get to a truth when you write. And that's what writing represents for me.
Do you, because you're on TV all the time, do you find it easier to write down your thoughts versus, because you seem like very easy to also speak them?
Yeah, it is. TV is just different. I mean, the medium is very instantly impactful. People, when you write something, might have to sit with it for a minute, or it just shifts them in a different way. With TV, it's much more thunderous. And so what I had to learn, as especially during the early stages of my television career, is how to be succinct. Is how to be succinct. Give them
radio people and writers really got to figure that out.
Got to, right? Like you don't have 1,000 words to explain. You got 30 seconds tops if you're lucky. And so you have to figure out how to do that. So it just forced me to use a different muscle, but it was all in sync with what you do and what I do as a journalist. It was the same thing, but shorter.
Just come up with a bar.
That's it. And I think it also helped because I never saw myself as a TV person. I was always a writer masquerading as a TV person. And when you have that mentality, I think you don't take TV as seriously. And by that, I mean yourself seriously. I took TV itself seriously, the craft and understanding it. I didn't take myself seriously. And there are people, as you know, in television that tend to take themselves very seriously. And so I always had a natural comfort in front of the camera because I was only trying to be myself, and that was it.
That's such a good distinction. So you've actually been earning a living writing since you were 15, which is wild because most people can't earn a living writing ever.
That is true.
So how do you think that your life experiences as a kid gave you an edge? Because you see things in a very particular way, which is why people gravitate towards you.
That's a really fascinating question. Is because your lived experience does shape you as a writer, and that's very true. So I think I was able, because I grew up in poverty, grew up again surrounded by addiction, and other things in challenging neighborhoods. It allowed me to have a level of empathy. Because I know what I had been through. I had been around people who had been through far worse and saw how their trauma played out in their lives consistently. And so it gives you a different sensibility. When you write without empathy, then you're never gonna reach a different place of understanding. And even if it was something that I could never have imagined for myself, if you just really do something as simple as putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, I think it's much easier to translate why something is important and means something. So while I may not be able to identify with LeBron James physically because he's 6'8" and 270 pounds and is, one of the greatest basketball players who ever played, when you read about how he grew up, his mother having him at 14 or 15 years old, living in 11 different houses, you can very much understand the pressure he's under. Or was under, to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated at 16.
And the tools he had to cultivate.
Correct, on the fly.
Yeah.
I mean, he was given $100 million when he was 18 years old. So you think about that and you think about what he's become, a successful husband and father and businessman. It's one of the most amazing sports stories, amazing American stories ever told. So I think the route to understanding it is not necessarily in how talented he is, but understanding what drives him. And I can understand what drives him because it drove me. And so that's what I mean about, like, if you approach writing and understanding the people you're talking about from a position of empathy and understanding those other circumstances, it allows you to have more nuanced conversations about them. I mean, that's not to say that people who do, LeBron doesn't fall into this category, but people who do like really awful things. I mean, I'm not saying that you don't go into it having a level of accountability either, but I do think the empathy is a core component when you write.
As you said that, I kept thinking that is exactly what differentiates your writing. I heard you talk about Michael Vick once, and I was like, she's the only person that's speaking about this with nuance. There's so much more to that story than just he did something bad.
Yeah, I mean,
It's that empathy.
It is the empathy, and I also, you just follow the course of things. It's just like, okay, he grew up in a subculture where fighting dogs was not wrong. He also is, at that point, I mean, I think financially the linchpin of his family. He has come into more money than he ever thought possible. And between the pressures of family, the pressures of being a highly paid professional athlete, I'm not saying that these things drove him to dogfight. What I am saying is that, a lot of people are trying to understand how somebody in that position could put it on the line for that. And that's the question, you're trying to figure it out. And to figure out, frankly, is that some people will never forgive Michael Vick and are harder on him than they are on people who have, no disrespect to dogs, but harmed actual people, I should say. So, I try to bring that level of understanding to it. But I have to say, the one thing I do not miss about television, because it was only always so important to me, I don't honestly miss having to come up with bite-sized viewpoints on people where nuance is required. And what I love about writing is that it begs you for the nuance. TV doesn't. Unless you are able to have an hour-long show where you can go on and go any place you want, which nobody does because you're trying to keep everybody's attention. TV just doesn't give you that. And I have to say, I do not miss on a daily basis having to put out sound bites about people I don't know.
The podcast space has given me that. Do you feel that way?
I feel that way. I love podcasting, and the reason why when I left ESPN, one of the first deals I signed was to do a podcast is because I miss the nuance. I miss being able to do this.
Me too.
Miss having those conversations. And just the nature of podcasting lends itself to intimacy, which you don't get in TV. So it was the perfect platform for me. And I do a lot of things, but the podcast really is a passion project for me.
It's a soul thing.
It is. Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
I did not know you love baseball so much.
I did. Let me explain.
Okay,
before,
can you clear this up?
Before the seam heads come for me. Baseball was my first love growing up. And people have to understand, one, I'm 1,000 years old. And because of that, there were certain things that are at our fingertips now that were not in existence. And we're talking about, the early 1980s, and the Detroit Tigers were really good. And they won World Series in 1984, and they were competitive for a while. And so growing up in the backdrop of your city's team being great is going to suck you in. And that's exactly what happened. And I used to listen to their games on the radio, watch them on TV. So when you followed your teams, you had to follow them either through watching the local newscasts, through some snippets on national news, or you have to read the newspaper, which is something that I did religiously, is I read the newspaper to follow my sports teams.
That's amazing. No one did
They don't do that now. They don't even know what a paper feels like anymore. But I grew up reading the newspaper, which was honestly divine intervention, because that sucked me into journalism, is reading about sports. And just reading about it, I was like, oh, so people write about sports for a living. That's interesting. And, fast forward to when I was a sophomore, junior in high school, is when I joined the newspaper staff. From there, I started working for the local newspaper, answering phones. So I've been very lucky to have always been paid as a writer. So since I was like 15, 16 years old, I've been a paid writer. So that in itself is like a tremendous achievement for somebody who had never heard of sports writing, growing up, or didn't know any sports writers. It was like, yeah, I'm gonna be a sports writer. That was the goal.
You write for one of my favorite outlets now, The Atlantic. And your bio says sports at its conversion with gender, race, and politics. I don't mean to keep bringing this back to geography, but I do think that people that grow up in cities where race is a part of their city more so have a different perspective. For me, Chicago's the second most segregated city in America. Race is at the forefront, so I've always thought about it. Detroit's very similar. Race has always been a part of that city.
Yeah, I mean, even though I grew up in a city that was, I think right now Detroit is the blackest city in the country because I think it's basically like 85% black.
Wow.
DC was the chocolate city that people were familiar with, and I know people look at Atlanta, but we have more black folks in Detroit than they,
I didn't know that.
have in Atlanta. I'm pretty positive that's the case, and even DC because of gentrification and everything, they've lost a little of the chocolatedness, if you will. But I say all that to say, even though you're growing up largely around people that look like you, the race informs the policies that lead to what you see play out every day. So you talked about the segregation of Chicago, which is very real and continues to be that way. In Detroit, it's the same way. The reason why Eminem named his movie 8 Mile is because 8 Mile is the dividing line between the city and the suburbs. Detroit, like many urban centers, was the casualty of white flight. There were race riots in Detroit. And when it got to a point with the auto industry, there were race riots in the plants. When the auto industry, where you had, black and white workers working alongside each other, there was a lot of beef, even though really they should have been on the side of being against ownership and the corporate nature of what they were doing. A lot of racial tension that developed there, and the race riots that happened in 1967. That wasn't even the worst race riot that ever happened in Detroit's history, which people don't know. But when the race riots happened, after that, white people fled the city of Detroit in droves. And see, when that happens, the reason why people point out the impact of white flight is that because of the perceptions of race, perceptions of black people, it kills your tax base. So all of a sudden, if you go from a city that is 1 million to suddenly you have like 200,000-300,000 white people just leave, then it's taking the tax base with them, which means it changes the dynamic of city services, of policies, schools, all of that. And, still very much at that time, and it still happens today in America, you have redlining, you have all these things that have happened to depress and oppress the people that are left behind. And as a result, Detroit fell on some very challenging economic times. Detroit used to be one of the richest cities in the world, and now it's one of the poorest.
Motor City.
The Motor City, yeah, because all, the Great Migration happened because everybody was trying to get the jobs in the plant, right? And so you have this very stable manufacturing base, and suddenly that starts to erode, and then you have white people who cross 8 Mile. They're all living in the suburbs, leaving the city behind to die. It becomes a very great racial divide. The odd thing is that now it's reverse migration. Is that a lot of white people moving back to Detroit because they're trying to birth some new industries in downtown Detroit. I go down there now. It is very strange because, and this is the impact of gentrification, whole nother conversation, but I'm like the only black person sometimes when I go into places, which is very bizarre because the neighborhoods are still all mostly black, except for there are pockets that are now getting many more, white people. So it's very different because downtown, is right off a riverfront, very prime property. So people have seen this happen in pretty much a lot of the major American cities, from Atlanta to DC, Chicago, is that when the cool industries come, the people who put their sweat equity into the city when it wasn't cool, they get pushed out. And they're all of a sudden want to appeal to a different type of Detroiter, which is not a black Detroiter. So it's the city has come back and come a long way, but for people who are longtime Detroiters, it's uncomfortable to watch because for years when nobody was going downtown, they were going downtown. And now they to some degree feel like strangers in their own city.
I wanted to touch on it because you were on a podcast, a Revolt podcast, and you said growing up black in this country is intertwined with the sports experience, how we frame sports, how we view sports, how we talk about sports. Can you say more about that?
Sure. I think we all see the optics when it comes to particularly football and basketball, because those are the sports that are dominated by Black athletes. So you have Black entertainment, the athletes, mostly white ownership, if not pretty much all white ownership, and large majority white fan bases watching the entertainment. So that racial dynamic in itself is very much a mirror of America, where you have a Black labor force, often working and usually borderline being exploited, if not fully exploited, by a white upper class to serve mostly, white people. I mean, I said this during COVID, and I think this is true, is that part of the reason why there was just this clamoring early on to just get back to work. Everybody has to go back to work. Like, forget about a lockdown and staying safe. Like, people were mad and hostile about their restaurants not being open, is because they know who it mostly affected. And so for a lot of people, it wasn't them, the service industry in particular. And even though you may see Black athletes making an incredible living, making 20, 30, 35, 40, however many millions a year, somebody wrote that check easily. Okay. And yet, a lot of times when it's the criticism, when it's all those things, people direct their anger at the product and not the people who are above them. And I find that to be very fascinating and very much on brand for America.
That to me sums up your view of the world. Like, I think that you think of sports as a microcosm of America, which is why your writing is so interesting.
It always has been, and that's why with The Atlantic, I wanted to specifically be given the license and the freedom to write about the intersection of race, class, gender in sports, because it is very definitive of the American experience, not just from a money standpoint, but in sports, you get to see things that you may not understand is happening in the real world, but when you see it in sports, it might register differently. Plus, sports is one of the few things that we do together. Like, a lot of experiences in America are segregated. Religious experiences, school, sports is not. It forces everybody together, because you could be from any economic background and y'all all could be Laker fans, and y'all all could be Pistons fans, or
it's unifying.
It's unifying.
It
and
is.
So that's why I think having conversations using sports as a lens or a backdrop are often more constructive, because people are able to lower their guard. They're able to understand somebody else through the lens of sports.
I've always felt that way about entertainment. And I came from a lot of teachers and professors, and they would be like, what are you doing with your life? Like, this is so, you cannot go do that. You're wasting your brain. And I was like, I see it differently. And I don't know, I feel the same way.
Yeah, no, I mean, entertainment is definitely a huge vehicle to look at race. Even when you look
and
at
gender
and gender and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you look at what we're consuming as people who are into pop culture, as wanting to be entertained, movies, films, they have an ability to make statements that other sectors of society can't make.
I agree.
Yeah, an ability to make you understand something that you never thought you would.
Okay, here's an insight I want to get your opinion on. The top 10 most followed people on Instagram are nearly all women. It's Taylor Swift, Selena Gomez, Ariana Grande.
Gotta be Kim Kardashian, right?
Yes.
Beyonce, maybe?
Beyonce is in there.
Yeah.
They're nearly all performers of some sort.
Right.
The top 10 most followed athletes are all men. To me, that signals that we're still not used to seeing women use their bodies to compete instead of perform.
Ooh, okay, dropping a bar.
What do you think?
I think there is probably a lot of truth to that. The best observation I can think of about why there's such a disparity is that I think, in the sports space, in the sports media space, women's, female athletes just they're not talked about in that same constant media cycle as their male counterparts. Serena is talked about, obviously, because she is about to, she's retiring or evolving.
Evolving.
Yes, not retiring. Sorry, Serena, I didn't mean to use the R word. But you have that, and obviously it was a U.S. Open. But they're not on ESPN. They're not doing daily Serena topics, but they'll do 700 topics about Tom Brady, whether it's in season or not. And so male athletes are constantly being focused, centered, discussed, dissected all the time. And with women, it's just not the same. But when it comes to music or movies, and even if a woman who's an actress has one movie out the year, the fact is, like, either who she's dating, who she's married to, her kids, like
Her body.
her body. It's so many things that are going to keep her in the news and being discussed and dissected all the time. So when I step back and take more of a 60,000 foot view, now I'm not surprised that most of the women who are in the top 10 follows on Instagram are in the entertainment space.
I don't want to harp on ESPN that much because you've done a million interviews about that, but I do have two questions. One is, I've heard you talk about how when you did His and Hers, which was before SportsCenter, that you were paid $200,000 less than your male co-host doing the same job.
Yep.
You don't seem mad about it.
So here's the thing, and I know that was quite a juicy headline, and the other part of it, it was also at that point the biggest contract I'd ever signed.
Yeah.
It was also the most money I'd ever made. So while there is something to be said for there being such a disparity for the same job, and some people just reading, it was funny, like reading some of the comments or what people would write to me, like, well, why did you sign the contract? Because I was getting paid over $400,000. That's why. Okay, all right. That's why I signed the contract. That's not bad. But at all. Like, that's a great living. If you'd have told me when I was 18 that I'd be making $400,000 one day or 400 plus, I'd be like, hell yeah, I'm taking that, right? And, other people are like, oh, well, Michael Smith was more experienced. Michael Smith is younger than me, okay? And we both, and that's
an insight.
Yeah, it's like Michael Smith's younger than me. I mean, that it wasn't based off age. I understood some of it just in the sense that Mike had been doing TV specifically longer than me, but journalistically, I had more years in the game than him. And I think it wasn't really about that. It was really mostly about we are literally at the same desk doing the same job. And to Mike's credit, and because he's my boy and one of my closest friends, Mike told me what he was making. Right. And he told me
the same scenario.
Yeah, it's like he told me what he was making because he wanted me to understand what I was worth. And we had those conversations, and there was a strategy involved with that too, with me and my representation. And that strategy was like, didn't get him this round, got something for him next round. And the next contract looked a lot different. Okay. And Mike and I were making the exact same amount of money. And I was, even given a sign-in bonus that was essentially a financial apology for the disparity.
That's good.
Pay equity became a real focus. Like, John Skipper, who's the president at the time, he said it publicly that he really wanted to narrow the gender pay gap at ESPN. And so I was a part of him really making good on his pledge to do that. So while yeah, that was definitely true. But what came out of it was something so much, greater. So I was still making good money, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I mean, there was something kind of initially a tad insulting about the fact that I was like, oh, this is interesting. But I found out in television, that's actually really common.
I mean, it happened to me. It was super common.
Yeah.
It's frustrating when you're in it because it's a passion career. Like,
Correct.
Nobody in it is like in it for anything else usually.
Yeah.
And it feels insulting.
But you want to be compensated for your work, and especially if, if we're sitting on this couch and we're both hosting this show and I'm making X and you making Y and it's a disparity, like and you're putting in the same amount of work. I know people like to judge everything based off like popularity and this and that.
Right.
Well, do you have the same followers or do all this kind of stuff? And I get that, and maybe that's a small part of the equation. But in and day out, if you have a show with somebody and you guys are doing the same amount of work to make the show great, it's kind of hard to be like, yeah, I should be paid less.
And so
Okay.
significantly.
And so significantly is one thing.
Yeah.
If it's just like a couple thousand, it's another thing if it's just like, well, damn, I mean.
200,000's life-changing.
Yeah, I mean that's a nice
big
chunk
sum.
of change, and thankfully, too, I'll add that by the end of that particular contract, we were not equal, but we were much closer by the end of that one until we got to Sports Center where we were making the exact same.
So you said that you became a better journalist when you became a better businesswoman. I'm dying to know what you mean by that.
When I became more vigilant about my money, and I think what happens is societal conditioning that we as women absorb, and it gets in our head. We very much, despite the fact we outperform so many times, we're carrying a tremendous amount of weight, but yet we have this conditioning that tells us we should be happy to be there. And when you have that, we should be happy to be there, it will cost you money because you will wind up taking jobs that are taking jobs and taking less compensation because you feel like somebody's taking a chance on you. And like, no, they hired you because you're talented and you're good. They didn't hire you because of charity. Like, I didn't get to ESPN because they were like, you know what? Let's come, little black girl. We're going to uplift you and you can be on this network and we'll pay you money. And because this is our charitable season. No, they hired me because I could do a job and fill a need that they had. So because we're constantly underestimating what we bring to the table, we have a tendency to take less than what we're worth. And so when I got out of that mentality, when I got out of the you should just be happy to be here, I became more serious about my money and I stopped worrying about how the people maybe in negotiation with, or the people that were pulling the purse strings, I stopped worrying about their feelings because all it took was me hearing enough stories. And this was the education I received at ESPN because, as you know, when you get in TV, it's treacherous. And people are really about getting their bread. And when I heard stories about some of the things people were asking for, and I'm like, why am I feeling bad? Like, why am I feeling like I'm asking for something I don't deserve when people have asked for bolder things than I have? And so I just think it's something as women, it's a habit that we have to break. It's hard because our behavior is policed so much differently. People calling us emotional, or sometimes if you are just assertive and you create boundaries, people want to call you a bitch for that and all of that because we get those labels so easily over things that men do all the time. We, instead of forcing other people to just have to deal with it or just learn to like it, we change or we tone down or we shrink or we start playing it to the back. Nah, I ain't doing that. Because especially when you're at your prime of your career and you got a lot of opportunities coming your way, you only got one time to make that money. And so you might as well make sure that you are getting the compensation you deserve. And plus, we have to start being open about what we're making. That's why I didn't have any problem telling people that I made less money than Mike, hoping that the next woman that's in that position will feel empowered to say, hold on, let me make sure that we getting paid the same for doing the same thing, right? And so I think we have to start being transparent about those conversations because a lot of these companies and businesses depend on our silence. They depend on it because if I'm not telling you hey, I had the same job since this is what they pay me, then they're allowed to have all the leverage. I mean, there's definitely been many occasions where some of my friends and even some people who I don't even know as well have come to me and said, hey, this particular school or this particular business, they asked me to come do a speaking engagement. They said they only had $15,000 in the budget. What did they pay you? Girl, they paid me 30. Ask for 30. Actually ask for more and make them come back to 30 if that's what they really have. I was like, know that the first thing they offer you ain't all they got, okay? So that's how you allow other women, all of us, to be able to boost one another up. I've never believed that we should be holding these things as state secrets because I think truly that when whatever industry, when we all begin to, succeed, it just raises every level for everybody else. And so, yeah, when I became a better business person, I became a better journalist because it is going to impact psychologically how you work and what you do when you know that you are getting paid what you deserve.
The idea that if you walk through a door, you have to like look back and bring someone else through is something that I think is spoken about, but you really live it. I think you're doing that with your podcast network with Spotify. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was not, in all candidness, this was not something I came into the door at Spotify thinking I wanted to do. I was only thinking about, okay, I know I want my podcast to be this. This is, kind of the involvement that I want to have is churning out a weekly podcast and talking to people and interviewing folks. But as I, dug deeper into that relationship with Spotify and just looking around the podcast landscape, I was like, there's certainly Black women who are podcasting, but not a lot. And there's not a lot of content, for Black women in a space that is exploding. And so from a creative standpoint, a leadership standpoint, I wondered what could I do to leave something lasting that will impact, amplify, uplift, and center Black women. And so I went to Spotify and asked them if we could partner together to create a network that specifically centered Black women. And the reason why, to me, that was the focus is obviously, one, I'm a Black woman, this just in, and two, I was just thinking about the bigger landscape. So we have a Black woman who's a vice president. We have Stacey Abrams trying to be the first Black female governor in history. In history, all right? We have so many, you look at the Democratic Party in particular, Black women have become the backbone of that party. From an education standpoint, Black women became the most educated group in the country. They were the only group who owned more businesses than their male ethnic counterpart. So Black women saving Wakanda, like they're doing all kind of things. And people tend to put us in this savior role of like, come save us, Black women, from the awful decisions we told y'all not to make to begin with. But we're much more than that. We're much more than mules and much more than saviors. And so I wanted to look at the fullness of who Black women are through wellness, through relationships, through trauma, through laughter and comedy, through all these different vehicles. And I wanted to create a network that really respected that really sort of really highlighted what Black women are.
You're producing Colin Kaepernick's 30 for 30.
Correct.
You tell a story about how this was after you left ESPN. Colin calls you and says, hey, they came to me with this. What do you think? I don't want to undermine you.
Which says a lot about him. And realize that, Colin and I were friendly, but we were not friends. He did not owe me that phone call. And had he never called me, I wouldn't have lost any respect for him. And in fact, I considered him factoring me into his decision-making to be very humbling because it was no reason to really do that. And when he asked my honest opinion, which I gave, and I told him that I thought ESPN was the best vehicle for his story, some people were surprised by that because, while I left there amicably, it was awkward, the way that I left. And some people might assume that I had some, bitterness toward ESPN, which I don't, or was resentful. And I was like, no, I think this makes a lot of sense for you. And for him to then say, well, I tell you what would make me really comfortable is if you came on and as an executive producer. And I'm like, don't threaten me with a good time. I mean, I'm here for that. Like, cause his story, needs to be told. And I'm just really, really excited about where we are with it.
I was shocked when you told that story. I think it'd be incredible if more people went out of their way like that.
Yeah, and I think for him to have that level of sensibility.
And I
And
think probably so many people did or didn't show up for him. He saw it in such a
I
stark
think
way.
you're right. I mean, I think there were times where he wished others had done the same thing. And it was a very, and I knew this before we started working on the documentary, but even more so, hearing him talk about what happened and what has been his life since he began his protest in 2016, it's so much lonelier than people have imagined in their mind to do what he's done. And you saw pockets of people standing with him, but very few people, really it's only one, his best friend Eric Reed, stood with him the entire way, to the point, Eric and of course his partner Nessa, but it to the point where it cost Eric, I think, his job in the NFL. So very few people did that. And
That's also a story that really hasn't been spoken
no, because people
about.
forget that, yes, Eric Reed, he did play longer than Colin in the NFL, but despite his production, when it was over with the Panthers, it was over in the NFL. I mean, his phone has not rung from an NFL team since. And you just, again, given what his production was his last year in the league, his age, the fact that he's still one of the better, safeties in the NFL, it was just really, it wasn't surprising. It was more of the same from the NFL, of penalizing people for daring to actually, take a stance against something we should all, frankly, be very vigilant about ending.
Uphill. It's a memoir. I heard it's the book that you never wanted to write.
It's not. I didn't want to
Why
write about
is that?
myself. I did not want to write about myself. And maybe that just comes from
It does.
it comes from two things. Is that one, I struggle with, and I feel like this is a relatable struggle for a lot of women, is I definitely struggle with appreciating myself in the moment. I'm a deflector. I'm a self-deprecating person. Like, I don't really like being the center of attention. So the idea of writing a memoir was like, no. And that doesn't mean I mind being transparent. Like, in a setting like this, like, you interview me, like, I'm going to give you honest, transparent answers. But to write a whole book about just me, I was like, oh, that sounds so lame. But many a great decision has been made because of this. The money was too good. I'm not gonna lie. That's just what it was. It was. I mean, my book, my literary agent at CAA was very honest with me, and he was just like, "There is a tremendous amount of interest in you writing a memoir." I was like, "You gotta be kidding me!" And
It's really cool.
it is, but at the time I was just whining about it. And I know he was like, "Are you insane? Like, do you know how few people, when their memoirs go to auction so that you have multiple bidders for one book? Like, it doesn't happen." And, so I had to suck it up and write a memoir. And as I got into the process of writing it, which started in 2019, it was really difficult, painful, but very rewarding. Coming out of it, I'm so glad that I did it.
Wow.
So thank you for offering me a lot of money to make me write a memoir.
And go through some therapy almost.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, it does. When you write a memoir, and I think this was frankly part of my fear, is that it forces you to relive, open up the boxes of your life that you have firmly put in the closet, that are in the back, the boxes you don't touch. We all have been through the moving experience where, like, all you're doing is like moving the same boxes from one place to the next that you never opened. I'm like, if I didn't open this box at the last 3 residences and put this away, why is this box still with me, right? And so for me, I was just really afraid to open a lot of boxes. And yeah, it was very emotional writing this. I mean, there was time where I was writing and crying at the same time. And who wants to go through that, right? Nobody does, yeah. But at the same time, I was really proud of myself when it was done. And I am glad it's over. But I think it allowed me to get out of that mode of constantly deflecting. So it was good.
If there's one not one thing, if there are two things that I have garnered from all my research for this interview, it's that you have a real conviction. That word kept coming up as I was watching your interviews. And you really believe in the truth, which I think is partly maybe why you went into journalism, but it's just inherent to you. So I think there's probably going to be a lot of that in the book, which makes a great read.
It is. I mean, it's a lot of it in there. I think people in their minds are probably assuming, because of, I've had a very public career, particularly the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
They're going to wrongly assume that that is the bulk of the book. Very small percentage. It might be 20%. I'll give you guys a cheat code. All the stuff about ESPN's in the back of the book.
Hell yeah.
Right, it's in the back, right? But
that was not your defining moment.
It wasn't, and and even the Donald Trump stuff is all in the back of the book. So
I love that.
yeah, it's in the back. Like that stuff I don't even get into until probably like the last 4 or 5 chapters. But everything that happens before then is really a journey into who I am and to what shaped me, and it's some triumphs. It's a good fair amount of ugliness. I mean, I really spend much of it talking about the very complicated relationship that I have, with my mother. And mothers and daughters go through things, and particularly having to witness and be in the middle of my mother's drug addiction was very difficult for me. And so I have to relive some childhood trauma. She had to relive some trauma, because I, interviewed her multiple times for the book, and it was tough. My mother has survived a lot. She's the greatest survivor I've ever known, and so by exposing my story, I'm exposing her story at the same time. So I am really curious as to how people will receive that. But I hope people understand that this is about how you come out of things and not how you stay in them. And so
that's the title.
I know, I wish I'd have thought of that before I came up with that title. Which wasn't, I mean, to be honest, that wasn't actually my title. Like the title I came up with, which I loved, my book publisher didn't love it so much.
What was it?
The title I came up with was Broken Curses. And, my mother, she used to talk a lot about how families can be beset by generational curses, where you're passing down trauma from, one matriarch or patriarch to the next. Like you're just passing it along and not really dealing with it. And they thought that Broken Curses was a bit too negative and not hopeful enough. But I was like, you breaking the curse though. It's not staying in the curse, you breaking it.
Okay, we do some rapid fire.
Oh, my favorite.
You ready for
Feed
this?
me.
Best sports film of all time.
Of all time.
Or your favorite.
I'm going to say, I always believe like saying the first thing that pops in your mind. Any Given Sunday.
A coach that you studied.
Well, a coach that I studied was my high school coach, Miss Bowie, Regina Bowie. She was my high school softball coach. And I looked up to her so much, and she was a great mentor to me. I think every athlete says this, like you think about what they taught you about the game, but you realize that there were really life lessons. And so she taught me a lot of very important life lessons. So that's the coach I probably wanted to emulate the most.
Why did your mom name you Jamel?
Because actually my mother, the story behind this is that wasn't the name she wanted. The name she wanted was actually Jemele, which in Arabic means beautiful. But while she was recovering from having me, my grandmother and my father conspired and changed my name while she was in there, and that's what wound up on the birth certificate, which was Jamel. But it's derivative of Jemele in her mind, so that's why she named me that.
It's unique.
Yeah.
What is a book that has changed your life? Something you think everyone should read?
Okay, I'll tell you the most recent one.
Okay.
Viola Davis's memoir. It's unbelievable.
So good.
It's unbelievable.
Yes.
I mean, so that one, a book I read, and I hated that I got on this book late because I think it came out in like 2015, 2016, a book by an author named Ya Jesse called Homecoming. Phenomenal. One of the best books I've ever read. And she's brilliant. I'll give you a third because I talk about books all day long.
love
But
It's a bookie podcast.
oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
I just finished this book. I believe her name is Leela Motley. She's out of Oakland. Night Crawling. Fantastic. That was actually the last book that I read.
Pretty smart card deck. We do a question.
Oh, okay. Do I get to pick or you pick?
Oh, yeah, you get to pick whichever one you want.
This is going to be something ridiculous. I can already feel it. What is the best advice someone has given you and why? How about the worst? The worst advice. That's funny. Great advice. Walter Mosley, the author, since this is a book intensive. Walter Mosley told me, I interviewed him for my own podcast. He's prolific. Like, he just writes. I'm like, how do you just write? Mm-hmm. And I was struggling at that point with my memoir because even though journalists have deadlines, you wind up writing by feel, meaning, I'm in the mood. It might be 3:00 in the morning and be like, let me bang this story out because I can feel it. I know where I want to go with it. I understand it. And so when you write that way, you're not very disciplined. And that's how I was doing my memoir. So I might, in one day, write 40 pages and then I won't write for 3 weeks. And Walter Mosley, what's been helpful for him, and he told me every day he gets up and writes for 2 hours, no matter what. He said, even if it's crap.
Did it change the way you write?
Totally did. And then I realized I had to stop being emotional about when I wrote and waiting until I was ready and just had to write. So then I made it a discipline, and then I set a time every day and wrote. And that's how I finished the memoir. And it's true, he was right. Worst advice I probably got is from a girlfriend about it. She sees that she'll know what it is. She was like, never tell the truth. Who cares about that? I was like, what?
Does she know who she's talking to?
Right. She was like, don't tell the truth. No one has time for that. And she was like, but why? It's so pointless.
Okay, Donald Trump.
I know, right? I was like, this is really awful advice. She was like, I'm just saying, no one cares. I was like, okay.
That's actually a really good answer to that question.
And I was hollering. I was just like, you are going to get me like in a total world of trouble. It was about a very specific situation. And I was like, this is awful advice.
The smartest decision you've ever made?
Oh, marry my husband. Wow. That is definitely the smartest decision I've ever made.
I actually want to do a whole separate podcast with you about that because it seems like you guys have the thing.
Well, the thing is that I guess that we have is like, obviously, there's love, there's affection, but there's mutual respect. And I have not been, I don't think really I ever have been in a relationship where somebody actually brought out the best in me. Mm. He actually brings out the best in me. And I want to be the best for him. And I have not felt that really at all, and which I was like, wow, cue all my exes somewhere like, what? I mean, different people mean different things at different stages in your life. Yeah. And so I think, that part was an unexpected twist in our relationship because I think generally speaking, most women, as me and my husband actually debate this a little bit because I told him, I was like, I think women have bigger egos, men have more fragile egos. And I know people are like, women have bigger egos only because of this. And I don't mean bigger egos with everything. I mean, particularly about relationships. And most women believe every person they've dated, they've been the best thing they've ever happened to them. Every woman believes this. Like, have you been the best thing that ever happened to whoever you've dated?
I don't think so.
Okay, you're like the first woman I've ever run into that has said that. Most of them are like, yeah.
I've also done a lot of therapy. So.
Okay, that's true. See, that's how you know. You're like, ooh, I'm sorry.
Because years ago, I might have said yeah.
You might have said yes.
Yeah.
I think most women tend to say that.
I agree.
Because we do really feel that way. And because of that, we miss a lot of key work we could do on ourselves. And so my husband is the first person who really exposed me. And I mean that in a great way. And because I struggled a lot with being vulnerable, a lot with it. And another reason I didn't want to write a memoir. And he didn't give me any place to run because he's very open, he's very honest. He's like direct, like, and so it put me in that space of discomfort to the
That's
point where I was like, I gotta deal with this. So I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but yeah, he made me want to do it, want to try to like really be unvarnished and vulnerable with him.
And do
So
it.
best decision I've ever made, smartest decision I've ever made is marrying this man.